Today we have two stories of strange eyes flashing in the night, of curious shapes scuttling just beyond the glow of your headlights, and of lingering terror that soaks into the very ground beneath your feet. Brace yourselves, because when the sun goes down, the real Texas takes over, restless, mysterious, and prowling in the moonlight. Step into the abyss, and welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and join our ever-growing community of the curious. Your support is the lifeblood that keeps this channel alive. Now, prepare yourself, for what you're about to witness is not for the faint of heart. I live about 30 minutes outside Denton, Texas. Let me say that Denton has never been known to me as some kind of supernatural hotspot, at least not in the way folks talk about places like Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Still, I've heard about the infamous Old Alton Bridge, locally called Goatman's Bridge by some, and the stories that swirl around it like dust devils on a hot day. You know, the typical local lore, sightings of a goat-like entity, strange lights, chanting in the woods at odd hours. We used to laugh about it in high school. I've hiked the nearby trails with friends, but I'd never seen or felt anything beyond normal, if not a bit creepy, older bridge vibes. Anyway, about 2 weeks ago, it must have been a Wednesday night, I was driving back from a late dinner with my cousin who was visiting from Houston. She's a city girl, not exactly the type to buy into small-town ghost stories. I normally take the main roads, but traffic was jammed up near the university for some reason. I think there was a concert going on or something at UNT, so I got the bright idea to detour. The GPS basically routed me down some smaller back roads, and before I knew it, I was coming up on Old Alton Bridge. This was close to 10:30 or 11 at night. My cousin was halfway dozing in the passenger seat, so I decided to slow down so she wouldn't freak out if the old rickety wooden beams made a noise. I was also kind of curious, I guess. The air was heavy, almost swampy, which is a bit strange for November. The temperature drop had come in earlier that week, but that night felt oddly warm. It's the kind of warmth that clings to you, sticky, and I remember rolling down the window a crack just to air out the car. That's when I noticed it. A smell like rotting vegetation mixed with something metallic. I told myself it was probably stagnant creek water, but I'd driven this area before and never noticed anything so pungent. My cousin wrinkled her nose in her sleep and shifted in her seat. I kept creeping forward, my headlights illuminating the old wooden structure in front of me. At that moment, my phone buzzed. A text from my neighbor, Pete. He's an older guy who used to work for the county roads department, mostly evening shifts. He told me I should be careful on the back roads because he'd heard from some local fishermen that there were weird sightings around the bridge again. Lights under the water, and even the suggestion of someone or something rummaging near the riverbank. Pete has always been full of stories, especially about local conspiracies. He once told me about a rumored government facility out by Lake Ray Roberts that was supposedly investigating unexplainable phenomena. I always took it with a grain of salt. Still, as soon as I read Pete's text, I swear something shifted in the darkness. It was a quick movement in my peripheral vision, off to the right under the bridge structure, somewhere along the creek bed. My cousin stirred, so I shut off the radio to see if I could hear anything unusual. Nothing at first, just the wind rustling through the trees. But then it was there, a low scraping sound, like heavy claws or nails dragging across damp gravel. I know how this must sound, but I'm telling you, every hair on my arm stood up. My cousin asked why we stopped. I didn't want to scare her, so I told her I thought I saw a deer on the side of the road. She's an animal lover, so she craned her neck to look around. That's when the scraping sound happened again, this time louder, more forceful. It reminded me of how an animal might paw at the ground, except it had an almost rhythmic pattern, like it was deliberate. In that moment, I glanced at the base of the bridge, right where one of the old stone supports stands. My headlights caught a glimpse of something large, hunched, and I guess almost pale in color, like it was wet or covered in a thin whitish membrane. It jerked away so quickly that I barely had time to register any detail beyond its extremely long limbs. My cousin gasped. She told me to drive, get out of there, but for some foolish reason I inched forward instead. The stench grew worse, like rotting fish carcasses. I fumbled for the flashlight in my glove compartment. I keep one in there ever since my dad told me never to rely solely on car lights for roadside emergencies. As soon as I shone it toward the creek bed, whatever this thing was shifted slightly behind the stone support. I can't say if it was crouched or kneeling. I just remember the shine of eyes reflecting back at me, not in that typical green or red reflection you see with animals, but a dull yellowish glow that seemed to pulse in and out, almost like it was breathing with its eyes. For a bizarre split second, I wondered if it might be some huge species of cat or a coyote with mange, though that wouldn't explain the color or the shape. My cousin started calling my name, borderline hysterical. She'd spotted the eyes too, and kept asking if it was a person. It was definitely not shaped like a person. The limbs were too elongated, and the arms, if they were arms, seemed to bend at a strange angle. The flashlight beam picked up an odd reflection, maybe moisture on its skin, but it looked nearly translucent in certain patches, almost reptilian, but not quite. I was about to back up the car when a truck came up behind us. The high beams from that vehicle lit the area so brightly, everything was a sudden wash of white. I think that's why we got a better look. The creature, I hate calling it that, but I don't know what else to say, scuttled on all fours from behind the stone support to the underside of the bridge. Its movements were jerky, like it hadn't fully mastered its own limbs. The driver of the truck blared the horn, probably annoyed we were sitting still on a one-lane approach. I looked up in the rearview mirror to motion that we'd move. But when I looked back, the creature was gone. No splashes, no further noises, just an empty creek bed and an echo of that foul stench. I drove forward, crossing the bridge as fast as the old wooden planks would allow. My cousin was trembling, and I was trying to keep it together enough to get us home. The next day, I told Pete about it, and he just shook his head and said he wished he could say he was surprised, but he's heard a half-dozen stories like mine over the years, stories that never quite match any known animal. He claims it's some kind of crawler humanoid, something that's either from a different dimension or an experiment gone wrong, possibly covered up by some shady government group. Pete swears that some nights you can see unmarked SUVs parked just off those back roads, scanning the creek with infrared cameras. That weekend, my cousin refused to go anywhere near that area, so we stuck to the restaurants near downtown Denton. I caught myself flipping through local news archives, half hoping to find a rational explanation, half hoping to find someone else who'd gone public with a similar sighting. There wasn't much, except for a few vague references to unidentifiable animals in letters to the editor from the 1970s, and one paragraph in a local forum from about 3 years ago describing a strange figure crawling under the old Alton Bridge around midnight. No photos, no videos, just scattered descriptions about that foul smell, elongated limbs, and a gaze that could chill you to the bone. I keep running through it in my mind, trying to remember every detail. Part of me wonders if it might have followed us across the bridge that night, but I didn't see any sign of it afterward. Still, for the next few days, I had the weirdest feeling of being watched whenever I was outside after dark. My dog, a big German shepherd named Titan, started acting skittish around the backyard fence. He'd pace and stare into the distance, letting out low growls at nothing I could see. My neighbor's security light flickered a few times at odd intervals, which might be just normal electrical issues, but in the context of everything else, it felt like part of the bigger puzzle. I don't know if what we experienced was connected to all those rumors swirling around the bridge. I don't want to jump to conclusions about government labs or interdimensional portals, but I do know something very real was there that night. Something that didn't look like it belonged in this world, at least not naturally. And whatever it was intelligent enough to hide as soon as we tried to get a better look. I have this gut feeling that chasing answers might lead to more questions than I'm prepared for. Still, I can't shake it, and I keep reading more about these cryptid sightings around Denton and Lake Ray Roberts. There's something happening out here, something we're not meant to see, or at least not supposed to talk about. My cousin is still a little traumatized, and she refuses to discuss it with anyone but me. Pete, on the other hand, keeps telling me I need to be careful where I poke my nose. He says people who go looking for these things often regret finding them, and honestly, he might be right. Anyway, that's the story, as best as I can recall it. Make of it what you will. I can't say I have any definitive proof, just the memory of those eyes and that scraping sound echoing in the heavy night air. It's enough to keep me wide awake, replaying that moment under the bridge over and over. A nighttime journey across an old bridge, a strange figure lurking in the shadows, and more questions than answers. Perhaps it's just a tale best left in the darkness. This next story might feel like just another night, but sometimes, out in those endless pines and oaks, certain shadows move in ways they shouldn't. You might wonder what that rustling could be, or if the pale flicker between the trees is just your imagination. I've got a story that's been burning in my mind ever since it happened last month, and I need to get it out there. Truth be told, I never thought I'd be one of those people writing to you with a weird story of my own. But I suppose none of us really expect it until it happens. This all took place up near the edge of the Sam Houston National Forest, northeast of Huntsville, Texas. I was out with my friend Ronnie and his older sister Melissa. It was a Saturday evening, early December. We'd decided we wanted to drive out past New Waverly into some of the lesser-known trails, looking to try our luck with some wildlife photography. Melissa's big into photography, especially at dusk when the lights got that golden glow. We had just enough time to reach a spot off FM 2693 before the sun completely set. We parked near a clearing that's commonly used by local hunters. That day was quieter than usual. No trucks, no ATVs. I don't remember hearing any gunshots in the distance like we sometimes do. It was still as if the woods were holding their breath. The only hint of activity came from a few crows spiraling overhead and that distant hum of the highway when the breeze shifted. I recall Ronnie telling us that his buddy, who hunts hogs out here, had mentioned something strange about this stretch of forest. He said the hog population had dropped off a cliff in recent weeks. Fewer sightings, torn up ground, or the usual signs of those animals. Ronnie's buddy joked that maybe there was a bigger predator around, something scaring them off. We laughed it off. But looking back, maybe it wasn't just a joke. We spent about 40 minutes taking photos of the scenery, the tree lines, and the early moon. Around that time, Melissa noticed a weird odor, sort of that wet dog smell, but sharper, and maybe with a slight acidic tang to it. Hard to describe. Ronnie shrugged it off, said the forest is full of weird odors if you know where to look, or maybe a raccoon had died nearby. I thought nothing of it, though it made my stomach flip a bit. We turned to head back to the car. figuring we'd come back tomorrow at sunrise if we wanted more shots. On the way, I started feeling uneasy, like we were being watched. I know that's a cliché. People say that all the time. But this felt different. My nerves were on edge for no clear reason. I swear I heard a branch snap behind us. Melissa spun around with her camera, hoping maybe it was a deer, but there was nothing, just the outline of trees, heavy with Spanish moss. Ronnie teased her about jumping at shadows, but I think he felt it too because he kept glancing back over his shoulder. When we got to the car, I realized I'd left my phone behind on a stump near where we'd taken some group photos. I decided to jog back, telling Ronnie and Melissa I'd be 2 minutes max. They stayed by the car, presumably packing up gear. Heading back alone wasn't my smartest move, but I figured it was no big deal. This was Texas woodland, after all, maybe some wild hogs or a stray coyote, but I wasn't worried. The air felt thicker among the trees. My ears picked up the sound of something moving, low to the ground, but I couldn't pinpoint where. Each step I took seemed to echo. The sun was basically gone by that point, so everything was tinted a deep purple blue. My flashlight cut a narrow path, and then I saw it on the ground, my phone, glowing faintly with a missed call from Melissa. I scooped it up, relieved. That's when my flashlight caught a glimpse of something behind a nearby trunk. I can't say I saw much detail at first, just a pale shape that vanished the moment light hit it. Instinctively, I swung the beam around, but it was gone. I tried telling myself it was just a reflection on the bark, maybe a bleached patch of tree fungus, but I remember the distinct impression that it had moved, like a quick jolt, pulling away. I felt that wave of unease surge up again, stronger this time. I turned to head back to the car. I only got a few steps before hearing the rustling again, this time more deliberate. Twigs snapped. Something was behind me, keeping pace. I whipped around with the flashlight, and that's when I saw it clearly, this pale, wolf-like creature, hunched over at first, but it shifted its weight onto 2 legs. It reminded me of a half-starved canine, yet tall, taller than me by a good half-foot. The fur was sparse, almost patchy, more like a thin covering of dull white or gray. And the eyes. The reflection came back as a faint, sickly yellow, not that bright eyeshine you see in normal dogs or wolves. My mind was racing, telling me there's no way this is real. It didn't snarl exactly, but I could hear a low rumbling sound, a kind of guttural vibration that made my teeth ache. The front limbs were elongated, almost like arms, with clawed hands, if I can even call them hands, that rested near its chest when it stood upright. It was like a twisted caricature of a wolf that learned to walk like a human. In that split second, I was too stunned to move. Finally, my body caught up with my brain, and I started backing away. I didn't dare turn my back on it. I remember I muttered something under my breath, almost like a plea, not even sure to who. The creature cocked its head to one side, as if it was studying me, and then it took a step. And that's when I took off running, darting the flashlight around just enough to make sure I wouldn't slam into a tree. By the time I burst out of the thicker brush into the clearing, I was drenched in sweat. Ronnie and Melissa looked startled. Ronnie said he'd heard me crashing through the undergrowth like a madman. Melissa asked if I was okay, said she tried calling my phone again. I told them something was back there, something not natural, and I pointed my flashlight, half expecting to see it charging after me. But all we saw were shifting shadows beneath the pines. We jumped in the car and locked the doors. Ronnie took the wheel and sped out of there. I could hardly catch my breath. Once we were on the main road, I tried to piece together what I'd seen. Some kind of cryptid canine, or dog man, if that's the term people use. It was definitely nothing like I've seen before, and I've spent a good amount of time outdoors. We debated calling the park rangers or even the sheriff's department, but honestly, who would believe us? I still can't believe it myself. A few days later, I mentioned it quietly to another friend who hunts in that area. He told me he's heard whispered stories of wolf people sightings around those parts for decades, especially near water sources in the forest. He said there's an old rumor about the government once collecting samples of some mutated canine in the 1970s, but it was never confirmed, just scraps of info from old-timers around town. I've never been big on conspiracy theories, but after what I saw, I'm open to anything. Melissa couldn't sleep for days. She told me she keeps seeing that pale shape whenever she closes her eyes. Ronnie won't admit it openly, but he's been more jumpy than usual. He keeps the porch lights on all night now. As for me, every time I replay the memory, I get that pit in my stomach. I start to wonder, if it could walk on two legs, does that mean it can pry open doors? Does it roam near the houses on the outskirts of the forest? Could it sneak into someone's yard in the middle of the night? The weirdest part is, I keep questioning if I should have taken a photo, but there was no time, no coherent thought in my head beyond get out. That feeling of being studied like an insect under a magnifying glass hasn't left me since. It's almost as if it was letting me see it on purpose, like a warning. I haven't ventured back to that stretch of the forest, and honestly, I'm not sure when or if I ever will. I'm no expert, but I know what I saw was real. If anyone else has seen something similar in the Sam Houston National Forest or anywhere nearby, I hope they'll come forward. Maybe there's a pattern or some local lore that can shed light on all of this. Until then, I'd advise caution if you decide to wander too far off the beaten paths out here. You never quite know what's watching from the tree line. And there you have it. Another unsettling glimpse into the moonlit corners of the world where normalcy slips through the cracks and something else emerges. A pale, wolf-like figure stalking the Texas pines, an image not easily dismissed. One can only wonder what other secrets the forest holds, waiting just beyond the reach of our headlights. And so, another strange encounter fades away. A trick of the mind, or something far more unsettling. That's for you to decide. Thank you so much for watching my stories. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support is what keeps this channel going.